Welcome to Westminster Open Lens. We are at our Reboot event over 2 days at the start of the new parliamentary season. We've invited in a number of speakers to look at the issues that are underlying and in some cases likely to dominate the coming 12 months. Our next speaker is Will Straw, who is the non-executive director of Open Britain. He was a prominent campaigner in the recent referendum to remain in. He's been an associate director of the IPPR. He's been active and one of the early adopters of the new internet ways of communicating in politics. But today he's here to talk about some of the material that he's written for the book Spirit of Britain and perhaps how Britain sees itself in the world. So, Will, over to you.
Thanks very much, Neil. I'm talking this morning about Britain's role in the world and our identity as it speaks to our place in the world in very volatile times. And I'll be taking my remarks from the chapter I've written for the book edited by Stephen Kinnock, which is called Spirit of Britain, Purpose of Labour. My premise is that Britain's role in the world should be characterised by a desire for security at home and peace and justice abroad. And although we've not always got that right, that I think has to some extent answered Dean Acheson's question, which John Denham mentioned earlier, about Britain losing an empire but failing to find a role following the Suez crisis. And I think it is also absolutely central to the Labour Party's ethos towards foreign policy, which of course is the point of Stephen's book. When we look at Britain's role in the world, I think there are three major shifts that are dominating the landscape as we look at it. The first, of course, is Brexit. As you said in your introduction, Neil, I was a Remainer, but I'm not here to argue today about the rights and wrongs of Brexit. I think where everybody can come together, whether they were leave or remain, is on 2 points. The first, that the government are making a terrible mess of what's taking place at the moment. New polling I've seen showing just 13% of people, that's 13% of people, think that Theresa May's handling Brexit badly. The other is it's a major distraction from a whole multitude of domestic and indeed international issues. That is stopping us from dealing with these other questions. And of course, I'm focusing on the foreign elements. The second is that the United States can no longer be considered a reliable partner. Much of our foreign policy over the last 100, 150 years has been predicated on the so-called special relationship with the United States. And Donald Trump's values are so far from our own in the UK and in Europe that we can no longer rely on being shoulder to shoulder, or if you're Theresa May, hand in hand with America. And although it may be an aberration, I think what we are seeing in America with the ways in which the democratic system works there and the role of some of the funding on the hard right, that although Trump will of course have to be replaced after a maximum of 8 years, that Trump is and may live on. So there are big questions about our relationship with the US. Third, the world is becoming more multipolar. So while we can't rely on our relationship with the US, while Brexit is taking place, the EU is distracted by other internal issues, such as the Eurozone crisis or the issues with its borders, so isn't able to play such a prominent role in the world. Meanwhile, China is rising more rapidly than even people predicted, and Russia is now engaged in a level of hostility that is unprecedented since the end of the Cold War. And while this global balance of power shifts, international organisations are losing their way. I've mentioned the EU, but we've not had a multilateral trade agreement since the early 90s. The G20 has an indefensible membership criteria and no real role or purpose. And the United Nations and their agencies, important though they are riven with bureaucratic stasis. But there are opportunities for us. We remain unique in our membership of the G7, NATO, the United Nations, and the Commonwealth, even if we do end up leaving the European Union. And we have the most immense soft power too, relating to the English language, the BBC, our development spending, creative industries, our universities, the Premier League, and the royal family. So there's a lot that we can do. So what are the priorities? What are the things that should underpin security at home, peace and justice abroad? The first priority has to be the terrorist threat. The events of last summer reminded us how suddenly things can change. 38 people killed on British soil in the attacks on Westminster Bridge, Borough Market, and of course in Manchester. And the security service is working every day to thwart these threats. Second, I think we must work with our allies to contain Russia and the threat that that poses. The territorial expansion that they've undertaken undermines the principles of national self-determination that have underpinned the world since the Second World War. The interference in domestic elections threatens the values of free and fair elections that have underpinned so much of the post-war settlement. And the cybercrime threat fundamentally destabilizes our democracy, but also our economy and public services as well. So we cannot ignore this threat. The final incoming priority must be to secure sustainable development and work with other countries on the goals that have been set by the United Nations, goals that are as relevant for us here in the UK as they are for other countries, and the best long-term means of delivering long-term prosperity and stability around the world, and of dealing with climate change, which, as we've seen over the summer, is sowing havoc in our country with the heat wave, but in many other places as well. So what should we do in addressing these challenges? A truly strategic foreign policy has to do something which governments have found hard to do, which is uniting our defence, our diplomacy, and our development. And starting with defence, the Conservatives unfortunately have severely undermined the morale of our armed forces, cut our diplomatic services back to the bone, and despite their commitment to development and to spending 0.7% of GDP on development aid, stayed largely quiet about the successes that that has delivered, creating a vacuum where opposition to development has been able to ferment. In terms of shoring up defence, it's quite right that there is now a consensus on a 2% of GDP target for defence. That was something common to both the Labour Party and Conservative Party manifestos. But there's a really important role in ensuring that the budget is spent in a much more focused way to ensure our troops have the equipment that they need, rather than focusing on vanity projects or big pieces of infrastructure of the kind that we've seen in recent years. We also need to think about how we deploy our armed forces. The foreign policy adventures of recent years cost us in blood and treasure and in reputation. The Iraq war has indeed caused chaos in the Middle East of the kind that wasn't predicted at the time by the government and made us more vulnerable to terrorism. So we have to rest on our international institutions in terms of the theatres that we enter, rather than relying on coalitions of the willing. But we should also cement our commitment to the UN by increasing our peacekeeping missions to which we contribute. We just have around 650 United Kingdom Blue Berets out of a total force of nearly 80,000. And there's no reason why we couldn't increase that. We should, though, also remember our responsibilities under the UN's responsibility to protect doctrine, which were adopted in the long shadow of the Rwandan genocide. So though we must ensure that our international interventions are always underpinned by international law, we shouldn't forget our moral responsibilities. In relation to the Middle East, one of the dynamic things that has happened in recent years following Iraq has been the strengthening of Iran to the expense of the regional hegemon Saudi Arabia. And that, of course, has led to the proxy war in Yemen, with 22 million people, including nearly all the children in the country, in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. And this is not a far-off conflict that we shouldn't involve ourselves in at all, because it will have a direct impact on the UK. It allows terrorists like Al-Qaeda and Daesh to to foment their activities, and it increases the numbers of refugees and economic migrants too. Although there's very little case for direct intervention, what we have to do is have a much more nuanced approach to our policy in the Middle East, which means being more of a critical friend to Saudi Arabia, prepared to countenance an arms embargo on a multilateral basis if they don't commit to what they are required to do, and developing our relationship with Iran, which is why the agreement is so important that Donald Trump has tried to tear up and must be preserved. Finally, in relation to Israel-Palestine, always a thorny issue, it's absolutely right that, as the Labour Party has said, and the Conservatives as well, the importance of a two-state solution, delivering a secure Israel alongside a secure and viable state of Palestine. But it's also right, as the Labour Party has done, to go further and call for an immediate recognition of the state of Palestine, which is something that I think would transform the debate in Israel as well as in the wider international community. In relation to diplomacy, Britain has a desperate need to rebuild our capacity after years of our embassies being diminished. And we must also address the further erosion of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office by the creation of the Department for Exiting the EU and the Department for International Trade. These should both be brought back into the Foreign Office, not least to ensure that in trade negotiations we are able to balance the interests of capital with those of labour, which will be extremely important if we do start negotiating new trade deals. The great irony of Brexit is that those Eurosceptics who wanted to take back control by removing any of the workers' rights that the EU has guaranteed want trade deals that actually lower our labour, consumer and environmental protections, and we have to ensure that that doesn't happen. Finally, we need to win the argument for development. This has been a massively important part of our soft power in recent years, but the policy has frankly proved unpopular around the country, and at a time of austerity, many people have not understood why we have expanded our aid budget. But it is critical for the obligations that we've made to other countries, but also in our own national self-interest, to create new markets for trade and to ensure that there aren't regions so riven by instability that there are refugees that need to be housed here in a responsible manner. I think there are 5 approaches to what we do about development. The first is to be much more vocal about the successes. Amazing success stories in terms of growth rates in Africa, Asia and Latin America that we don't talk about. Children lifted out of poverty, educational attainment enhanced. Still much to do, but much achieved, and the success stories are something that people should hear about. Second, we must encourage other countries to raise their commitments. At the moment, alongside the Scandinavian countries, we stand alone in committing 0.7%. The US contributes 0.17%, although it is the largest in absolute terms. But Germany with 0.5%, France with 0.37%, Canada 0.28%, and Australia with 0.27% should all give more and help share the burden. Third, we should begin a debate about the circumstances in which we would begin to wind down development spending. The architects of the 0.7% target always saw it as a temporary measure. If we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030, will that be the time to start ramping down our commitments to other countries? Should we continue to stop funding countries like India when they reach a certain level of prosperity? Fourth, we've got to call out illegal activity, foul practice and poor standards, as took place with the Oxfam scandal. There can be no place for those kinds of activities. And we should also look to reform the overseas development assistance rules that allow us to give money in areas that aren't always classified as aid, but might be genuine development priorities, including sometimes disaster relief and climate change. And finally, there should be a greater mandate for the CDC group, a relatively unknown part of the government armament, originally called the Commonwealth Development Corporation and established by Clement Attlee in the 1940s, has a portfolio of investments worth about £5 billion around the world, which can drive sustainable development and prosperity, but it's constrained by the Treasury, which demands an annual return for the British taxpayer of over 10%. If that was lowered to ensure that returns were still of 6, 7, 8%, then there would be an opportunity to expand the portfolio hugely. So, to conclude, the 2016 referendum result may have resulted in a sugar rush of patriotism for the UK, but the hit is certainly now wearing off. And whether we leave on March 29th or stay as the result of a people's vote, which seems to be growing in people's minds, there will be a multitude of challenges facing the country, while our credibility is at the lowest ebb it's been arguably since the Suez crisis of the 1950s. My belief, and the underpinning of the chapter in Stephen Kinnock's book, is that the only way to address this challenge is through the values of internationalism, social justice, environmentalism, and equality. These are the values that are fit for our times, and the only values that will help us address the many challenges in the world and help Britain find a proper role. Thank you.